A black veteran shows up at the airport with a solemn duty, escorting the remains of a fallen soldier home. But the moment he steps to the counter, everything changes. A cold airline employee refuses to let him carry the casket on board, demanding it be shipped like luggage. What happens next stuns the crowd, sets off a viral storm, and sparks a national conversation about race, dignity, and what it truly means to serve. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more powerful stories that matter. It all started on an ordinary morning at the Atlanta airport. The morning light in Atlanta crept in slowly and cold through the glass walls of Hartsfield-Jackson, like a judgment long delayed. Elias Monroe stood beneath it, not in uniform, but in something deeper, dignity worn thin but still intact. His coat was pressed, his posture proud, and beside him sat a wooden box polished to a solemn shine. Inside it were the remains of Private First Class Langston Reed. Now, I don't ask you to remember his name because it is tragic. I ask you to remember it because it is familiar. Because Langston was not some abstraction of patriotism, not some ideal wrapped in stars and stripes. He was a black boy raised by a mother who taught him manners before America taught him suspicion. A boy who died for a country that still wrestles with whether to see him as a man. Elias had been asked to bring him home. Not just back to Georgia, but all the way home, to his mother's arms, to his sister's mourning, to a place of rest. And that kind of homecoming cannot be checked like luggage. It requires presence, witness, love. But the woman behind the airline counter, Ms. Croft, her name stitched in polite embroidery on a navy blue blazer, looked at the box, then at Elias, and offered a smile colder than the marble floor beneath their feet. "I'm afraid human remains must travel in the cargo hold," she said. That was the first fail. The first polite, quiet, regulation-wrapped refusal of dignity. And like all the others before it, it came without the use of slurs, without the shouting we like to film for our moral amusement. No, it came wrapped in professionalism, in policy, in the well-pressed grammar of institutional indifference. Elias showed her the documents, the same documents that had been enough when he'd escorted white soldiers home. But suddenly, this time, it wasn't so simple. There were protocols, she said. There was a procedure. You see, racism in America no longer wears white hoods. It wears uniforms, carries binders, and offers customer service surveys at the end of the interaction. He reminded her, softly, with the kind of restraint that only comes from years of learning not to be the threat they already think you are, that Langston was a fallen soldier. That he had earned more than storage beneath suitcases. She smiled again. I understand this is a sensitive matter. But she did not understand. She had never been made to understand. Because understanding would mean acknowledging the hierarchy hidden beneath the policy, that some bodies, even in death, are given seats, while others are given space, out of sight, out of mind. Behind Elias, the line grew. And with it, the weight. The weight of eyes, of expectations, of generations. Not all of them are hostile, but most of them are silent. Watching. "Sir," she said, voice now clipped. "If you continue to hold up the line, I'll be forced to call security." There it was. The unspoken threat. That in a matter of minutes, this man, this Marine, could be rebranded not as a veteran, but as a problem. Because that's what this country does, isn't it? It reclassifies its heroes depending on the shade of their skin. It honors the uniform, but not the man inside it, unless that man looks like he belongs on a billboard and not on a back street. Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise a fist. He simply said no. And in that moment, my friend, I want you to understand that no carried with it every tired, yes, Black Americans have been forced to say. Every nod, every step aside, every time dignity had to be deferred for the sake of survival. No, he said again. Not today. But the thing about America is, it never hears you the first time. Not when your voice comes from a place it spent centuries trying to silence. And that was just the beginning. The silence that followed Elias Monroe's quiet refusal did not last long. It never does. Silence, in America, is not allowed to remain still, especially when it is born of black defiance. It must be filled. And so the murmurs began. From behind him in line. From the clerk now stiff at the counter. From a supervisor summoned like smoke through a vent, quiet, sharp, and ready to extinguish any flame that burned too close to the truth. "Mr. Monroe, is there a problem here?" the supervisor asked, adjusting his badge as though his title could shield him from moral consequence. "There's no problem," Elias said, "just a promise I intend to keep. Now, I want you to pay attention here, not to the noise, but to the pattern. Because patterns are where the truth hides in America. We've come to expect racism to be loud, but most of it is whispered behind doors labeled policy." Elias presented his paperwork again. Military credentials. DoD authorization. Names, numbers, signatures. All correct. All ignored. "There may be exceptions," the supervisor said, "but our standard policy is to place remains in the cargo hold. But standard, you see, is where injustice has always hidden best. Slavery was standard. Redlining was standard. Sending young black boys to die for a flag that barely waves for them back home? That, too, has been standard." Elias stood tall, but inside, the battle had shifted. He had once faced fire in Fallujah, but nothing there prepared him for this quiet war, waged not with bullets, but with the soft language of bureaucracy, where every word means nothing and everything all at once. A crowd began to form, pulled in not by sympathy, but spectacle. Phones emerged, because this is what we've become, a nation that documents pain for entertainment before we intervene. One woman whispered, "Why is he making such a scene?" Another man muttered, "Rules are rules." But rules, my dear elders, you know better than anyone, have never been neutral. They are the bones of the system, and the marrow of that system has always been soaked in inequality. Let me ask you this. How many of you came home from war to find doors still closed? Uniforms didn't keep you safe on southern sidewalks, did they? VA loans didn't always stretch across skin tones, did they? And when you buried your brothers, some were laid to rest with brass bands and open highways. Others? They were boxed and shipped like freight. Elias understood this wasn't just about Langston anymore. It was about the long memory of injustice, disguised today in airline regulation, tomorrow in a job application, next week in a courtroom. He looked around and saw not just faces, but the ghosts of every black man who'd been told his grief was too loud, his pain too disruptive, his love too unreasonable. And still, he stood there. Not shouting, not pleading, just being unmovable. A black elder, Vietnam veteran, judging by the cap, stepped beside him. Didn't say much. Just rested a hand on Elias's shoulder. That hand said everything. You ain't alone. And you're not the first. Meanwhile, the airline staff huddled, whispering like priests guarding a doctrine built on the backs of the forgotten. They feared backlash, not because they were wrong, but because they were seen. And isn't that the deepest fear of systems like this? To be seen. Naked. Unjust. Fragile in their pretense of fairness. This was no longer about a box. It was about the bodies this country has tried to box away for centuries, still noble, still beautiful, still denied. And the question hanging in the air, unspoken but undeniable, was simple. Who gets to be escorted home with honor? And who gets left behind, even after death? There's a moment in every man's life, especially in the life of a black man in America, when he realizes that discipline will not save him. That respectability, even when earned in blood, is not a shield but a whisper in a wind that refuses to listen. Elias Monroe stood in that moment now. The supervisor had returned. A thin man with tired eyes and a voice smooth like river stones, carefully chosen to suggest reason while reinforcing refusal. His name was Mr. Pearson, and he spoke like every administrator who ever said, "I understand," and meant, "I do not care." "Let's step aside and discuss this," he offered, the way one might guide a child away from grown folks' business. But Elias was not a child, and this was not a discussion. This was a ritual. A black man being told again that his devotion must be deferred to someone else's convenience. "I've got authorization," Elias said, slow and measured. "From the Department of Defense." Pearson nodded, his mouth tight. Still, we must follow our internal protocols. Internal protocols. My God, how many times have those two words been used to deny us our humanity? What is slavery if not a protocol? What is segregation if not an internal policy? What is a lynching left unpunished if not a system deciding what lives are worth justice? Behind them, the line grew longer. The whispers sharpened into soft judgment. People were inconvenienced, and in America, inconvenience is the greatest sin, unless, of course, it's suffered by someone black. A security officer approached. Young, unsure, his hand twitching near his belt, not because Elias was a threat, but because he had been taught to think he might become one. Elias felt that all too familiar shift in the air. The kind that black men know from grocery stores, classrooms, job interviews. The kind that doesn't need to speak to be heard. It says, you're being watched, measured, weighed, and already suspected. Still, he didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, placed a hand on the wooden case beside him. His name, he said, voice low, was Langston Reed. He was 23. He served this country with everything he had. And I promised his mother I wouldn't leave his side. And there it was, that unbearable truth, you can't outrank grief. Not with badges or policies or power. A hush fell over the growing crowd. Something had shifted. This was no longer just an argument at an airport counter. This had become a reckoning. A confrontation with the casual cruelty of indifference. It is a peculiar thing, how quickly empathy becomes inconvenient when it must confront race. A fallen soldier was one thing, a noble symbol. But a black fallen soldier? Escorted by a black veteran refusing to be dismissed? That was not noble. That was disruptive. Mr. Pearson's tone grew firmer. Sir, if you continue to escalate, we will have to remove you. Elias didn't blink. Then do it. But I promise you, you will explain to every mother in this country why a man who died in uniform was treated like baggage. And that, dear friends, is when the camera phones rose. Because America will ignore a black man's plea, but it fears his platform. The truth, when recorded, is dangerous. And as the lenses turned toward him, Elias stood steady. Not angry. Not afraid. Just firm. The way his father had stood in the face of redlining. The way his grandfather had stood while drinking from colored-only fountains. The way every man who loved this country more than it loved him has stood. Because the burden of love in Black America is this: you're expected to serve a nation that won't serve you back and still be graceful about it. But sometimes grace looks like resistance. Sometimes it sounds like no. And sometimes it won't move, no matter how many uniforms ask it to. Because love, when it's real, defends the dead. And dignity, once claimed, is not returned. It begins with a murmur, then a ripple, then a shift so subtle most people miss it until it's far too loud to ignore. Elias Monroe stood unshaken at the check-in counter, a single black man refusing to shrink. But what started as a lone act of resistance had begun to swell. Not because America heard him, but because America saw him. And we must understand this. In this nation, the visibility of black pain often matters more than the truth of it. A black man with a flag-draped box is tragic. A black man demanding dignity for that box is dangerous. And when he's filmed, when he is recorded not breaking down, not lashing out, but standing still in conviction, that's when the whole myth begins to shake. Phones were lifted. Screens flickered. A crowd gathered, not for Elias, not even for Langston, but for the spectacle. And in that crowd, something began to stir. She arrived quietly, Lila Jameson, a journalist who knew all too well that this country only listens when the story is inconvenient enough to threaten its comfort. A black woman in a press badge and a leather-bound notebook, her eyes scanning not just the scene, but the soul of it. "I'm sorry," she said, stepping forward, "but who's in charge here?" Now, hear me, when a black woman says those words in public, it is not a question. It is a declaration. It means, you've gone too far and I'm here to name it. The supervisor straightened his spine like a guilty man before a judge. There's nothing to see here. But there was everything to see. There always is. Lila asked Elias for his name, And he gave it. Staff Sergeant Elias Monroe, retired. I'm here to fulfill my duty to Private First Class Langston Reed. The name cracked the air like thunder. Langston. Not remains. Not cargo. A man. A son. A soldier. A black boy who wore the same uniform as white boys, but whose death was being processed like an Amazon return. Lila turned to the supervisor. What's your justification for denying this man the right to accompany a fallen soldier in the cabin? The answer, of course, was wrapped in policy. Always is. But the people around them, the veterans, the mothers, the watchers, knew better. They had seen this before. Let him take his friend home, someone called out from the crowd. And there it was, truth spoken from the edge. Once whispered, now shouted. A woman approached Elias. 60, maybe. Skin dark as walnut, eyes lined with both sorrow and fire. Was he your family? She asked softly. Elias nodded. Not by blood, but in every way that matters. She placed her hand atop the wooden case. Then he's mine too. And let us be clear, my friends, this was not sentiment. This was lineage. For centuries, Black people in America have formed families not just through kin, but through care, through grief, through shared burdens and stolen names. Now, the airline employees, once confident, stood uneasy. Because now it wasn't just Elias. It was an army. A silent one, but not invisible. Veterans in faded caps. Mothers with folded flags in their closets. Journalists are tired of writing the same story. The supervisor glanced at the growing sea of witnesses, then back at the computer. He saw not just paperwork, but backlash. Because in America, policy bends only when pride is at stake. I'll consult with operations, he said finally, voice thinner than before. Elias didn't move. His hand remained on the case. Not in protest, but in promise. You see, that's the difference between outrage and loyalty. One burns quickly. The other endures. In that moment, as strangers formed an impromptu wall around Elias, I saw what this country fears most. A Black man standing in love, not in anger. Surrounded. Supported. Unmoved. That is not a protest. That is a prophecy. And the people in power, God help them, had no idea what they had just awakened. They called him the remains. They typed it in all caps, HR, human remains. They logged it in their system with the precision of a well-oiled machine that has long since forgotten what it carries. But Elias Monroe would not let them forget. He had a name, Elias said, his voice low, firm, like thunder waiting behind the hills. Private First Class Langston Reed. 23 years old. He wasn't a package. He was a person. And in that single declaration, he did what systems fear most. He made the dead undeniable. He called a Black boy by his name, in public, in protest, and with love. Because in America, it has never been enough for us to die. We must also prove we were worth mourning. The crowd around Elias thickened. A mother pressed closer. A veteran stepped forward. A young boy in a hoodie tugged at his father's sleeve and asked, "Why won't they let the soldier sit with him?" That, my friend, is the kind of question that slices through the policies. Not because it's clever, but because it's honest. The supervisor returned, this time with a different tone, less confident, more calculating. Your documentation appears to be in order, Mr. Monroe, he said, glancing around at the phones and faces. We can make arrangements for you to accompany the remains. It was the beginning of retreat. Not because they understood, but because they had been seen. And in this country, justice often comes not when the system feels shame, but when it feels pressure. Still, Elias did not gloat. Because he understood something deeper, this wasn't a victory. It was a delay in defeat. Lila Jamieson, the journalist, stepped beside him. Has this happened before? She asked the airline staff. Vanessa, the woman who first denied Elias at the counter, paused. Her voice caught somewhere between training and conscience. There have been similar cases, she whispered. Off the record. And there it was, the ugly truth bleeding through the seams. This wasn't the first time a soldier had been boxed in cargo. It was just the first time someone had refused to look away. You see, Racism in America does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives dressed in protocol. Sometimes it hides behind a counter. Sometimes it sounds like, "I'm just doing my job." But whether it whispers or shouts, the wound it leaves is the same. Elias placed both hands on Langston's transport case as if to shield him not from harm, but from humiliation. A woman nearby began to cry. Quietly. "I lost my son in Iraq," she said. "When he came home, they treated him like a hero." She looked at Elias, then at the case. This boy, he deserved the same. Skin shouldn't change that. It shouldn't. But it does. We live in a country where your worth is measured not only by the uniform you wear, but by how you wear your skin beneath it. And, even in death, the black body is made to prove it belonged. Elias stood silent for a long moment. The crowd now a congregation. A journalist scribbling furiously. A mother mourning a boy she never knew. A nation caught, once again, between the story it tells and the truth it hides. His name was Langston. Say it. Say it like it matters. Because if this country forgets the names of the dead, especially the black ones, it will never understand the cost of its silence. And some silences are as loud as gunfire. There comes a moment in every confrontation when the tide turns, not because justice has prevailed, but because power has been embarrassed. The supervisor returned. His tone clipped, his tie tightened, his eyes scanning the crowd now gathered like witnesses at a quiet revolution. Elias Monroe had not moved. His hands remained steady on the wooden box, not out of stubbornness, but out of love. And let us not forget, black love, when it refuses to step aside, has always been mistaken for insubordination in this country. "We will make arrangements," the man finally said. And just like that, the machine began to adjust, not because it saw Elias, but because it could no longer ignore him. Yet Elias did not smile. Because what they offered him now wasn't grace, it was damage control. This, my elder friends, is a pattern you know too well. You were here when they opened the schools, but closed the doors. When they gave the vote, but gerrymandered the power. When they said, "You are equal," but still locked the gates. And now, they said, "You may escort your friend," as if they were doing him a favor. Lila Jameson walked beside Elias as he moved toward the gate, the box now permitted to follow him, not because it belonged there, but because their image couldn't survive the alternative. "You do realize this isn't the end," she said. He nodded. "I know. They'll call it an exception, not a correction." Behind them, the murmurs had grown into voices, mothers, veterans, journalists, students. And among them, the contradiction grew louder. This country that demands the service of black men still doubts their right to grieve. Think of that. Elias, a man who had served 3 tours, who had buried more brothers than most preachers, was treated not like a bearer of sacred duty, but like a man asking too much of the system that promised everything and delivered little. On the plane, Langston's box was placed in the first-class cabin. Carefully, quietly, the same way injustice likes to be swept under the rug. A flight attendant, black, like Elias, placed a hand on his shoulder. "My brother served," she whispered. Elias nodded, exhausted. "He made it home?" "He did," she said. "But not all of him." And there it was again, truth wrapped in silence. How many black men have made it home in pieces, body intact, spirit broken, only to find that the war they left behind had followed them back in the eyes of every clerk, every cop, every boardroom? You see, the great contradiction of America is not that it asks black men to serve. It is that it asks them to disappear after they do. The plane rose, and Elias sat in the soft leather of first class, but there was no comfort. Because black dignity, even when permitted, must always be negotiated. He looked out the window, not at the clouds, but at the country below. A country that salutes the flag, but flinches at the truth. And as he rested his hand once more on Langston's box, he whispered, "You should have never had to prove you were worth remembering." Because even now, in the hush of the cabin, Elias knew. This was not a resolution. It was merely the pause between battles. The plane touched down in Mon, Georgia, with the same stillness that follows a storm not yet named. The ground was dry. The sky was clear. But don't be fooled, not all weather is seen. Elias Munro stepped onto the tarmac, wooden case in hand, his spine still straight. He had done what he promised, brought Langston Reed home. But what waited for him now was not peace. It was reckoning. The small honor guard arranged by the airline, a gesture soaked in belatedness, stood in uniformed silence. And behind them, like pillars of grace carved by sorrow, stood Langston's parents, Gloria and Henry Reed. She was tall, in a simple black dress. Her husband stood beside her like a monument holding in its breath. No words passed at first. There was only the sound of footsteps and memory. Gloria stepped forward and laid her hand atop the wooden case. Elias did the same. Two black hands, weathered by time and trial, cradling what was left of a young man who once believed in a country that had never fully believed in him. "Thank you," Gloria said finally. Elias nodded. "It was my honor, ma'am." Henry's voice was heavy but steady. "We heard about the airport." Elias didn't flinch. "It was handled." "Not from what we saw," Henry replied, quietly. "It's all over now. Facebook, CNN. People are talking. And now we must pause here, for this, too, is the burden of being black in America. Even your grief must serve the public. You can't just bury your dead. You must explain them, defend them, prove their worth. And if you do it well enough, maybe, they'll be remembered." Later that evening, Elias sat on the porch of the Reeds' modest home in a neighborhood older than most truths we like to tell ourselves. Gloria brought him tea. Henry lit a cigarette, then put it out. The silence between them was full of names never spoken aloud. Then came the question, low, deliberate, heavy. Was it because he was black? Elias had heard this question before. Not just in words, but in eyes, in sighs, in empty spaces where justice never arrived. He looked at Henry, at Gloria, and then out at the darkness folding over the street. "I've done this before," he said. "For white boys. Not once did they ask me to put them in cargo." Gloria didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She just knew. "Because every black mother in this country already does." "My cousin's son served too," she said. "He came home injured. They forgot about him within the year. And so here it is, the deepest contradiction of our so-called union. We ask our black sons to die for America, but we still won't let them sit beside us when they return. Not on planes. Not at dinner tables. Not in textbooks. Not in memory." That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He walked through the house, past pictures of Langston as a boy, as a teenager, as a soldier. In one photo, he stood in his graduation cap, grinning like the world had just opened its arms. In another, in uniform, his eyes were older than they should have been. "You see," Gloria said, appearing in the doorway. "He believed, even when he shouldn't have." Elias nodded. He was proud. Of serving. Of doing it right. "That's what hurts most," she said, her voice soft but sharp. He gave everything, and still had to be fought for just to be treated like a man. And perhaps that's the cruelest irony. To be born in a nation that demands your belief in its promises, while quietly ensuring you never fully receive them. Langston Reed was one of the best. Smart, brave, and black. And for some, that last fact still outweighed the first two. Elias looked again at the photo on the wall. Langston, arms folded, eyes forward, standing in the sunlight of some other dream. "You shouldn't have had to die twice," he whispered. "Once in battle, and again at the airport. Because that, my friends, is the truth America still cannot name. That Black Death isn't always the end of a life. Sometimes it is only the beginning of a negotiation." By the time they laid Langston Reed in the ground, the sky above Mon, Georgia had gone a kind of quiet that feels like judgment. Not divine judgment, no, but something older, something earned. The kind that lingers not because of what's been done, but because of what's been ignored. The church was full, black families dressed in Sunday pain, soldiers in sharp uniforms, local officials who hadn't shown up when Langston enlisted, but came now that cameras did. And in the front pew, Elias Munro sat stiff as steel, carrying the invisible weight of a promise kept and a question unanswered. Would this country ever change, or simply learn to hide its shame more elegantly? The preacher, a wiry man with fire behind his words, rose to the pulpit and let loose what few dared to say aloud. My nephew died in service to a nation still deciding if boys like him can be heroes. He paused, looked out at the congregation, then back to the casket. But let it be known, when the system tried to reduce him to cargo, one brother stood up. One soldier said no. And in that no, we heard the echo of every ancestor who refused to be silent. The crowd erupted, not just in applause, but in release. It wasn't just about Langston anymore. It was about every son who came home in a box, every daughter denied recognition, every parent forced to wear composure like armor. After the service, Gloria's daughter, Amara, only 20 years old, approached Elias. She didn't cry. Her eyes were sharp. Her voice is steady. "Thank you," she said, "for standing up, for being with him." Elias tried to smile. "He was with me too, in ways I didn't even understand until now." Amara studied his face, searching for sincerity. She found it. "I'm pre-law at Spelman," she said. "Used to want corporate law. But now, I'm thinking about veterans' rights. My brother gave too much for it to end like this. I want to make sure it doesn't happen again." And there it was, that spark. The kind of fire you've seen before, my dear elders. The one lit by injustice and fanned by memory. The same fire that burned in Montgomery, in Selma, in Harlem, in your own tired bones. "Your brother would be proud," Elias said. "I don't need him to be proud," she replied. "I need the system to be different." Outside, the people lined the streets. Flags waved. Signs read "Honor all who serve," but the tension remained. Because patriotism without equity is performance. And Black sacrifice has too often been met with "thank you for your service" on one side and structural silence on the other. Later that evening, in the living room of the Reed home, Elias sat with Gloria and Henry. A candle burned. Photos of Langston, smiling, running, saluting, lined the mantel like quiet indictments. Henry turned to Elias. "What happens now?" Elias stared into the flame. "That depends on how long people are willing to stay angry, on whether they let this become a hashtag or a movement." Gloria shook her head slowly. "It's already happened too many times. And it'll happen again. Unless we build something that outlives the rage." So they talked. They planned. And from that conversation, something was born, not out of hope alone, but out of refusal. A refusal to allow Langston to be remembered only as a problem at an airport counter. Weeks later, a national campaign was launched, the Langston Reed Initiative for Equal Dignity, calling for reform in how military remains are handled, how families of color are treated, and how the nation remembers all its dead. The story spread. Senators called. Networks interviewed. But Elias never let them turn it into a neat redemption arc. "He died believing in this country," he told one journalist. "It's time this country learns to believe in him." And here, my friends, is the cruelest beauty of being Black in America. Even our grief must become activism. Even our mourning must be organized. Even our love must fight. As Elias stood once more beside Langston's grave, months later now, a stone marker where a wooden box had been, he placed a hand on the cool granite. "We're not done," he whispered. And he meant it. Because hope for us has never been a luxury. It is a wound that refuses to close. A wound we carry, pass down, and still, somehow, miraculously, refuse to surrender. And that refusal, in a land built on forgetting, is the purest form of memory, the loudest form of love.